Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Maria Hawilo, and she is based in Chicago and has just co-authored a book, Dismantling Mass Incarceration. So welcome to our show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David, for having me on and for the opportunity to talk about this book, which includes these incredible pieces from these incredible collaborators. So we're very excited
so
to showcase it.
Start with how that all came together.
Sure. I think there are three of us who co-edited the book. My colleagues, Premal Dharia and James Forman Jr., and we sort of came to it from from slightly different places. But in short, we're all formerly public defenders, or former public defenders, and then went on to teach and advocate and work in communities, et cetera. And as we were doing that, as I was teaching students about mass incarceration, there were all these wonderful books written by incredible writers about the causes of mass incarceration. There were studies done on the consequences of mass incarceration. What I kept hearing from students and what my colleagues kept hearing from ordinary people in communities is, well, what can we do about this? We recognize the outrage here. We understand that this is a social injustice issue and a civil rights issue and a racial justice issue, and particularly after the murder of George Floyd. But what can we do? What can we, members in our community, do? What can we, educators, do? What can we, law students, do? What can we, impacted people, do? And so we started talking to one another. That is, Premal, James, and I started talking to one another. And in the process of debating these ideas, and obviously we each have our own experience and working with people, directly representing them, and debating ideas with other colleagues and reading thousands of articles, we came to this and said, look, we want to show the system, this disorganized, non-unified system as it is, and show that there's no single sort of person or actor responsible for building mass incarceration. And so, there are all these opportunities where real people can sort of impact the system. And so that's how it came about. It's been a years-long process of talking and debating and sort of highlighting and these tensions. And we're so grateful to our collaborators, to the folks who we included here, who really sort of been instrumental, I think, in shining a light on how to dismantle.
So I think part of this story is kind of the story of federalism and the story of this kind of crazy government that we have, that there are multiple levels. And I live in California, for example, and you go county to county in California, and I go into courtrooms all the time in different counties, and it's just a completely different world, even though you're really operating under the same laws. It really is a remarkable thing.
Absolutely. And I teach criminal law to about 75 law students every spring. And what I typically say to the law students, and I think what's surprising, is there isn't one single system. We have this vision, I think, of a federal system where crimes are being prosecuted and it all looks the same. And in fact, as many people have pointed out, what we're really thinking about here is, and what we're seeing is, all these systems that are really county by county, and urban and rural and large and small, and they all have different needs, and everyone wants to address safety and harms. But the question is how to do that in a way that doesn't expand the tragedy and the harm that's already occurred. And so that's sort of where we meet in criminal law. And then every county and every jurisdiction and every system approaches it differently. And we wanted to show that we're not running away from that tension, because that also means there are opportunities in each of these places for real change. You know, the US Supreme Court doesn't ultimately sort of really dictate what is happening in each of these specific counties, where state courts are intervening and trial courts and other actors. So I think it's been that part of the book has been really enriching, at least for me, to work on.
Did you learn anything that surprised you in this process?
Oh, that's such a great question. Yes, I think one of, despite the fact that I've really been working in and within and writing about the criminal justice system for the entirety of my legal career, I think what I learned is that it's not just for us, the conversation around mass incarceration has changed, I think, quite a bit. I mean, this is not a conversation we were having when I first became a public defender, of the years that I was defending people. I think what we learned is that there's this tension. Obviously, I mean, it's a complex issue, and that's, if you've worked on it, that is readily apparent. And the racial injustices, anyone who spent any time thinking or working on it or meeting anyone impacted by it, that's also readily apparent. But the sort of the tensions, everyone sort of most people agree that the system is an outrage. How to dismantle it, there is a good deal of disagreement and debate. And I think I learned in undertaking this process just how much disagreement there is, and yet people are trying different things. Jurisdictions are trying different things. Legislators are trying different things. Voters are campaigning for progressive judges or progressive prosecutors, and sort of you see these approaches working in some ways and then needing to change in other ways. And so you know, I remain hopeful. I think that because there is sort of change happening.
It's an interesting point. And you mentioned, you know, the racial disparities. And I think, you know, at one level, I think we all kind of understand how America works and how it has worked in the past. But then you go into a courtroom, and I remember this experience, I think it was last summer, where I was sitting in a courtroom in San Francisco covering a case, and I realized that on the public side of the bar, I was the only white person in that courtroom, and it was a full courtroom. And I'm like, wow, you know, it really hits you when you notice that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and if it doesn't, then we become or we become desensitized to something that we shouldn't ever be desensitized to. There's been incredible work in this area of sort of just shining a light on the racial disproportionality, and also just the rank racism. You see it from arrest all the way through aftermath. And there are other systems in play that, you know, are also part of the cause here. But you can't, talking about criminal law means talking about racism and disproportionality. And there's been a focus on it, on trying to, you know, decrease that gap. And that's really important. But we still see it. We walk into courtrooms in urban places, and you look around, and that experience, the one you described, is one that I've heard students talk about. You know, sometimes we have foreign students come in, and we take them and they talk about it. And I think, you know, I'll add to it one other thing, and that is, and that's why I'm so excited about this book. Much of our criminal system is really almost hidden away. It's not entirely transparent. It's not easily accessible to the ordinary person. State courts, trial courts, local courts, even in big cities, are hard to get to. You're standing in long lines. You don't understand the rules. Cell phones are taken away. Public courtrooms are public, sure, but it's not entirely clear when judges are taking the bench or not. And so shining a light on it and just learning about it is, I think, a step forward.
So I'm going to ask you a follow-up question on this, which is basically that, you know, often you'll point out this inequity that, hey, there are a whole bunch of people of color in the system, and, you know, the defensive response is, well, aren't those the people that are committing the crimes? How do you respond to that?
I think, well, first of all, the racial inequities we don't just see them in our prison system where people are imprisoned after being convicted of crimes. We see stark racial inequities in our arrest rates, in our traffic stop rates. If you look at a recent report that's just come out, for instance, out of Chicago, out of Cook County, there are reports out of Washington, D.C. and other places where the traffic stops, for instance, there's a disproportionality. There are more stops of people of color, of young Black men, than there are disproportionately of other people. And so that's before any commission of crimes. That people sitting in jails are presumed innocent. They are generally not, they have not been convicted of crimes. People who are detained while awaiting trial are presumed innocent. And there are inequities and inequalities and a bias with respect to who is getting out and who is not. We see the disproportionality at all stages of the system, well before any conviction for any crime. And so I think it's important to note, and that's why sort of looking at the system as a whole, starting with policing, where most cases come into it and most people come into contact with it, is really important. Because if we start with prisons, then we lose sight of the fact where we're getting all these inequities.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, because prisons are almost the back end of everything, right? Like, what we really need to start looking at are, you know, where this is starting, which is, you know, the neighborhoods, the houses, and the schools. I was just reading this account of somebody that ended up in prison, and I was stunned because she was like expelled from school as a 12-year-old for having NoDoz in her backpack. And it's just like, what in the world is somebody thinking? And of course, her life spirals from there to low points. But it's that initial ridiculous overreaction by the school that kind of sets all of this in motion.
Yes, and I mean, I think we could even, one of the consequences, I think, mass incarceration, this both surveillance and carceral system, is that community members suffer. Our other systems suffer, right? Whole communities are left without their people for long periods of time, or even short periods of time, in and out. Children are left without their parents, and we know that children who grew up with an incarcerated parent suffer educational in the educational realm. And so now we're impacting children in our education systems. We know that healthcare suffers and public health suffers in communities where you have higher or greater disproportionate prison rates and jail incarceration rates. And so, you know, it's true, you're like starting with arrests, even before you get to schools, or looking at communities and the consequences of mass incarceration. Without, you know, children even being arrested, we're seeing impacts on their educational outcomes. But then add to it our and Professor Chris Henning has written an incredible book on this, where she talks about, and she's an expert on this, on representing children who are caught up in this school to prison pipeline, and all the ways in which we've traumatized our children, and disproportionately are Black and Brown children who grow up in already marginalized communities, some of them. So we can each, as former public defenders, tell stories. We each started in the juvenile system in the DC Public Defender's Office, and meeting a young person who is, I've had clients as young as 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, and trying to explain this system to them, and then also seeing what they're being prosecuted for in some cases. It is shocking, is probably, and it's outrageous, and it's part of our mass incarceration. I will also say that the conversation has been shifting, I think, towards change. You see fewer young kids transferred to the adult system. You see more jurisdictions changing or increasing the age. And those are all good things, I think, as part of dismantling the system.
Yeah, Professor Henning likes to tell the story of the teen girl that shoves her boyfriend, takes his cell phone away to look and see who he was texting, and the SRO ends up arresting her for robbery, and that's how this girl gets involved in the system. I mean, it's just stunning. So from your perspective, where do we start?
I mean, I think this is, what we've spent years doing. I think from my perspective, any one of these places is a great place to start. It sort of depends on the needs of the local community, the needs of the people who are impacted, the needs of the people who are harmed, the needs of the community itself and the system within that community. For some people, we start by organizing and learning about our local elections. Who are the sheriffs and the prosecutors and the judges running? Many of our judges are elected, they are not appointed, and they are the judges who will make decisions, as we see in the book and we show in the book, about everything from, whether someone is held in jail while presumed innocent, awaiting trial, and all of the consequences that flow from that, including potentially loss of children and jobs and so on, to, they can put their finger on sort of the plea bargaining stage, sentencing decisions, and we highlight some of the judges who are really taking into consideration mass incarceration and its impact, and calling out, for instance, the racism that has infected the system. So for some people, starting means becoming familiar and educated about local election systems and really organizing and voting. For other people, it may mean working with organizations like Dwayne Bett's organization and helping to bring education back into our prison system, where we've sort of stripped dignity and humanity from human people. And it's quite unlike what we see in other parts of the world, and also its own outrage. For other people, it means working to abolish, learning about organizing efforts, the kinds of efforts that Ruth Gilmore undertakes, and trying to abolish some of these systems or refunding. So I think the answer really depends on, and for others, it just means learning about it. And that's a huge undertaking, right? And it's an important one, because sort of the system in the shadows is what allows us to maintain the status quo. And so I, for one, am very excited and have been hopeful about the ongoing open dialogue that I think is helping to change the conversation. We want ordinary people to be talking about this.
And from the perspective of this book, where did you and your colleagues kind of see eye to eye, and where did maybe you guys differ on things?
Well, that's a great question. As I said, we didn't always see eye to eye, and you see some of those tensions in the book, and we didn't shy away from it. And I'll let them speak for themselves. I think it, there is discussion in the book about abolition, and then there's discussion about reforming or changing, or incrementalism, that is taking small steps forward, even if it feels like it's not a whole lot. Versus, well, should we really be funding even good things? Like, let's say we believe in sort of representation. Are we creating, contributing to the system? So I think there was this real sort of debate about what are these changes that we hope to see? What is it that we think? Look, we made a lot of decisions in this book, right? We had a lot of, there were hundreds of thousands of pieces of writing about the carceral system. And so we had a lot of decisions to make about what we think might work given our experience. And we don't have sort of one single solution, as you see in the book. And so I think the debates we had are demonstrated in the book.
And where do you come down?
I guess I would say I'm convinced that there isn't a single solution. I'm convinced that highlighting and educating and learning about this civil and racial injustice issue is critically important. And I, at a minimum, think we need to talk about and inject dignity into these systems. And that means for every single person. I'm not entirely sure where I come down with respect to the debate or the tension. I find Derek Purnell's essay compelling and convincing. I also think, for instance, in the policing chapter, but I also think Sharkey's work on a greater anti-violence campaign makes a lot of sense. And so what I want to see happen is just sort of people trying all of these things, because I think that we are, and I'm hopeful that it's going to change, because it has to. We can't keep locking people up and treating or mistreating people the way we've been mistreating them, and then arguing that we're being kept safer. That's not working. And so I don't know if that's a non-answer, but I'm convinced that learning about it is sort of the first step, and doing something with that works within your own community is the next big step.
No, I think that's a fair answer, because, I mean, if we had the answer, we'd probably have already done it. If it were easy, right? And I think at the bottom line is kind of where we come down on all of this is that, what we're doing isn't working. And a lot of people, I'm afraid, don't even understand that part, because they say, well, if somebody's a danger to society, we need to lock them up. But the part where I think they fall down is that most people that get locked in a cage are going to get out of that cage at some point. They are not going to spend the rest of their life there, and they shouldn't. But the way the system works is we make it extraordinarily hard for somebody who's been locked in a cage to get released and become a normal, everyday citizen who has a job, has security, and therefore is able to function in society without causing more problems for themselves and others. And I mean, if we were trying to design a system that would ensure that people are going through a revolving door, I don't think we could do it better than what we've done for the last 40 years.
I think that's right, David. And I think it spans even longer than that. There's excellent work by folks like Khalil Gibran Muhammad and others who show that we're really talking about using the criminal system as a tool of racial oppression that spans way back. And we sort of designed it in some ways that way. And we've got to do better. And I think some of what we're highlighting here is these are the ways that folks are doing better in all these different places. And it may not work right away. And it may not work within a few years, but the system wasn't built in a year or two either. And so we have to do something because it's not working.
And I think that's the other problem is that, you know, it seemed like we were moving in the direction of criminal justice reform. The pandemic hits, life is disrupted, the crime rate goes up, the murder rate goes up. And then all of a sudden people were like, oh, this ain't working. Let's try something else. Let's go back to locking people away. And so every time people get, you know, scared or their security or their safety is threatened, they fall back to what didn't work before, but they thought worked.
Yeah. A very natural reaction, right? It's a natural reaction because we all ultimately want to be safe and want to feel safe. And it's true, right, that it's cyclical a little bit, sort of how we feel about safety, and sometimes it has nothing to do with crime rates themselves, but rather the perception. I will say, I think that, you know, as a result of a number of different things, the pandemic, the largest protests, I think, worldwide after the murder of George Floyd, and this sort of reckoning with our prison system, we saw people starting to make change. And then, you know, there's a twist and a turn, and it's not a direct line. So sometimes it feels like it's not really happening. And I think it's important to call out when the change isn't quite working or when it doesn't seem like it's really happening. But I also think it's good to note those places where things are working, where people are really grappling with what is it that we need police for? Is it for traffic stops? Can we change something about traffic stops? Maybe changing something about it might still have downstream consequences, and we need to think about that. But at least we're having the conversation in different places, and that alone to me is a sign of progress. And I'm hopeful that, and I'm so grateful for the collaborators who've really shown some of this in this book. So
what would you say is the main takeaway that you want readers to get from reading the book?
Well, thank you for that question. I think there are a couple of things. I think the main takeaway is that, look, here's, first of all, here is when we talk about the system, here's what it is. What we're talking about arrests and policing, but we're also talking about what happens, as you just mentioned, or as what Professor Michelle Alexander called civil death. What happens long after someone is released from prison or from jail? Here are all these consequences and all these limitations and the exclusions of being part of society again. That's the system. And so I think what I'd like is for people to understand this system is not one thing or involves only one actor, because I think that what ultimately that means is we have opportunities to intervene, to be heard, and to make real progress along different dimensions. And I hope that people read the book. I hope that people, we've written sort of essays, the three of us, that capture each chapter, these intros that capture each chapter. And then I hope that they sort of take away how different people are grappling with these tensions and don't shy away from it. And then come out with what they think is best, and have conversations with their community members and people at their churches or temples and really grapple with it.
And then finally, what can the average person do?
Oh, I think that there's so much, and that's what I think is most hopeful. They can, as I said, I think they can Some people can intervene by being court watchers, right? Just being present in these courts where so few people go. That's a pretty big deal, and you see how things change when information gets out. For some people, they're journalists, they can sort of report what's going on in our local courts. For some people, the average person can learn about, I really think it's critical to learn about our local judges and elections and prosecutors. They speak on our behalf. And so learning about them is just as critical as learning about and vote for the people you want to speak on your behalf. They can form book clubs so that they can sort of learn about these issues. I think there's so much here. They can become jurors in a case. There is so much here where they could contribute. And I think that's hopeful.
So the book just came out?
It did yesterday, yeah.
Do you have it on you? Can you hold it up?
I do have it on me. I can hold it up.
All right. Dismantling Mass Incarceration, a Handbook for Change.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing about your amazing book.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me. And we're so thrilled.
This has been Everyday Injustice. We've been talking with Maria Hawilo, and she has co-written, co-edited the book, Dismantling Mass Incarceration. You've been listening to Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mouse Quake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com.